welcome back to another true crime video. Sorry it took me so long to upload again. Life's been pretty crazy, but I'm back, and thank you to everyone who stayed subscribed. It really means a lot. It definitely feels weird being in front of a camera again, but we're gonna push through. As always, before diving in, I would like to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no harm or disrespect to anybody involved in the case. This is simply information that I have gathered for the purpose of keeping these stories alive, spreading awareness, and maybe along the way bringing the victims and their loved ones justice. I always encourage you all to do your own research as well, and let's just get right into it. Utah in August. Despite it being one of the hottest months, it's also a time when summer starts winding down and everyone's fitting in the last of their summer activities before fall approaches, school starts, and we gear up for the winter. And that's exactly what two fishermen were doing on Saturday, August 21st of 1971. They were in a canal near an area called Goggin Drain where they spotted what they thought was a mannequin. But once they got closer, they were shocked to see that it wasn't a mannequin at all, but rather the corpse of a young woman floating in the water. Keep in mind, this was 1971 and cell phones weren't a thing. So these men drove to the nearest town, which was Magna, to report what they found to the police. Once investigators arrived at the scene and pulled the body out of the water, it was clear to see that what happened was no accident. Investigators determined that this young woman had been shot in the head and chest 9 times and stabbed in the chest and stomach 4 times. And as if that isn't brutal enough, evidence also showed that she had been pistol whipped and sexually assaulted. It didn't take long for police to identify this woman as 18-year-old Johanna Leatherbury. Johanna was born May 17th in Cedar City to Jack B. and Gail Strong Leatherbury. She had 8 siblings, 6 brothers and 2 sisters. She graduated from Olympus High when she was 17, and according to her obituary at the time, she was an employee at Bailiff Hall, which was a dormitory at the University of Utah. Like with most of these cases, I couldn't find too much about Johanna herself, but from the articles I read, she seemed like a genuinely sweet and caring person. She would make time to visit her father at the VA, who was an injured World War veteran. Her nieces said that she would treat them like adults and invite them to go out for coffee with her and her friends. Despite her mature and considerate nature, Johanna was an 18-year-old girl, and like most 18-year-olds, she liked to go out with her friends and have fun. And on the evening of Friday, August 20th, 1971, that's exactly what she did. She said goodbye to her family and headed out the door, nobody knowing that it would be the last time that they would see Johanna. That night, she met up with friends at a popular hangout spot referred to as the Complex, which was located around 2100 South and State Street and was best described as being a vacant field at the time. It was said that kids from Skyline and Olympus High hung out in this area often. Johanna's brother, Jack Leatherbury, said, quote, "They played games and do what teenagers do," end quote. The 2 high schools are only about a 4-minute drive apart, so I'm sure that many of the students knew each other from growing up in the same neighborhood. Also, let's not forget that Johanna had just graduated from high school at this point, so I'm sure that she and all of her peers were making the most out of these last summer months before they all ventured out into the world of adulthood. But at some point on that Friday night, things went horribly wrong. There's not a lot of information on that night itself, but it was said that people who were at the complex that night, quote, "last saw Johanna getting into a car with at least 2 males and other individuals," end quote. And that in itself is extremely important, but it's like, come on, how much more vague could that statement be? We don't get what the car she was getting into looked like, or even a rough estimate of how many people she was last seen with. I don't know, I just find it super weird that we know that she was last seen getting into a car, but we don't know what the make, model, or color of that car might have been, or even the hair color, height, or race of the 2 males that she was last seen with. It's said that these teenagers frequently hung out in this area, and I would assume a lot of them knew, or at least knew of one another, and I just find it hard to believe that nobody that was there that night had an idea of who these people were that she was last seen with. I mean, it is a strong possibility that the people that Johanna was last seen with didn't attend either Olympus or Skyline High, or maybe they were older. It's also possible that alcohol may have been involved, which could hinder people's recollection. I'm not discounting any of these possibilities, but even if that were the case, I still think people, or at least one person who was there that night, could have had an idea of the descriptions of the things that I mentioned before, such as the color or the make of the car, or even a physical description of any of the people that Johanna was last seen with. Now, it's important to note that the public was given a description of two vehicles that were around the area she was last seen, and we will get into that later. But there was never a description of the car that she was last seen getting into, or the people she was last seen with. Johanna's car, a white Chrysler, was found abandoned the next day on Westminster Avenue between State and 200 East, which was a couple of blocks away from the complex. When I read this, I thought, why would she park blocks away? I mean, granted, it's not that far, but why not park closer? And this is also where things start to get a little confusing for me, because I try to be as accurate as possible. The vacant field where Johanna was last seen was located near 2100 South and State Street and is now occupied by a Salt Lake County clerk's office and an assisted living development, according to multiple news articles. But there's one news article that states that the vacant lot was located near 2500 South and West Temple, which is only around a 4-minute drive from the first address mentioned. It could very well be a typo. I just hate when I get conflicting statements, especially when it comes to the area where a person was last seen. But regardless, I believe that all other sources were correct in saying the location where Johanna was last seen was the 2100 South and State Street and not the 2500 South and West Temple. I really hope I didn't just confuse you. I just thought that it was worth mentioning because I don't even know how that address came about. Weirdly enough, Johanna's purse and wallet were found on the roof of the World Motor Motel, which was located at 1900 South and State Street. It turns out that two juveniles, one of them apparently being an industrial school escapee, admitted to rifling Johanna's car Saturday morning and stealing Johanna's purse, which was left on the back seat. The two then threw the contents of the purse on the roof of the motel and left the purse itself under some nearby bushes. After interviewing the two juveniles, investigators cleared them and said that they had no part in Johanna's murder. Something else very interesting is the following morning, a night watch worker at Morton Salt Company said he saw a brown International Harvester Scout driving at around 5 a.m., which investigators believe could be around the time her body was dumped. But investigators located the owner of the vehicle and eventually cleared him as well. I've said this before in other videos. The public is not entitled to know every detail of a case. I understand that, and I understand why it's important. But I would really like to know why these people were cleared, because both of these people could be considered pretty strong leads. A car seen in the early morning hours near the area where her body was found immediately sounds like pretty damning evidence. And the two juveniles who admitted to breaking into Johanna's car and stealing her purse, I mean, what a coincidence that they did this the same exact night that Johanna was brutally murdered. Obviously, they were juveniles at the time, and certain rules and protocols need to be followed to ensure their privacy. I get that. I don't care so much about who they were. What I care about is why police were so sure that they had nothing to do with Johanna's death. Because again, it's one hell of a coincidence, and I would really just love to know what made investigators say, yep, it's clear these guys, they had absolutely nothing to do with Johanna's murder. But of course we never got that, only that they had in fact been cleared. And I found this part of the case particularly intriguing, so I started doing a little digging on the Utah State Industrial School, where one of the juveniles had escaped from at the time. And I actually found some pretty interesting stuff, so stick with me here. The Utah State Industrial School was a juvenile reform school that operated in Ogden, Utah from 1889 to 1983. In the summer of 1891, a fire had destroyed most of the building, and the Ogden Military Academy offered its vacant buildings while the school was to be rebuilt. And in 1896, the school took over the site of the Military Academy permanently. Over the 20th century, the school was often scrutinized, and in 1909 it was investigated for graft, which for lack of a better words means political corruption. In 1963, the pressure was intensified after a juvenile shot and killed Detective Sergeant Marshall N. White during a robbery. Now, if you're from the area, that name should automatically ring a bell. Marshall White was a well-known officer that cared about his community, and his death affected a lot of people. So it was no surprise that the Marshall White Recreation Center was dedicated to his memory on the 5th anniversary of his death. Today, the Recreation Center remains a busy place with people of all ages utilizing it. In 1973, the state considered closing the school due to overcrowding and lack of adequate facilities, and in 1977, it was renamed the Youth Development Center. In 1980, charges were finally brought against the school for inhumane conditions of confinement, and it was finally closed in 1983. In 1984, the site became what we know today as the Ogden-Weber Technical College. So there's a little fun history lesson that some may find interesting if you're familiar with the area. Okay, so you're probably like, cool, but what did any of that have to do with Johanna? Well, there is something I found interesting, and that was the location of the school. It's located in Ogden. Johanna was in Salt Lake. It's nearly a 45-minute drive from the industrial school to the area where she was last seen. So, and I know it's not that far, but I guess what I'm getting at is, how did two juveniles get from Ogden to Salt Lake? Did one of them have a car or even access to one? If so, what kind of car was it? I mean, it's quite possible that they use means of public transportation, but we don't know. Also, why were they in Salt Lake to begin with? You could rifle through cars anywhere. Why there? You could argue that one of them was on the run, so they obviously wanted to distance themselves from the place they ran from, but again, we don't know. I just feel like it's such a huge coincidence that it'd be nice to know a little more detail around why those boys were cleared, and that would have been possible to do without releasing their actual identities. Anyways, moving on. A few weeks later, on September 5th of 1971, Captain Haywood of the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Department said he saw links between Johanna's murder and the murders of a bread delivery man, Michael Bone, and florist W. Rulon Shaw. According to an old news article at the time, a .22 caliber pistol was used in each of the killings. Interestingly enough, the news article also said that the descriptions of the cars in both the Leatherbury and Bound case are virtually identical. So, like I said earlier, apparently we do have a vehicle, folks, and we will touch on that in just a minute. Detectives also said that the mode of operation, the slayings, were similar. The latest of the killings was Michael Bone, who was shot in the head during the robbery of a Salt Lake market. A woman by the name of Carolyn Kingston, yes, Kingston, she was indeed a member of the infamous Kingston family, worked at the market and was present at the time of the shooting. She was also shot in the head but remained in critical condition until she later died from her injuries nearly 2 years later. Shaw, the florist, was found with a bullet wound to the head at his Ogden floral shop August 24th, and police said that he was robbed. Did you notice what I did? This particular murder took place in Ogden, where one of the juveniles escaped from. Coincidence? Maybe. So before we dive in and dissect all of that, I have a little more to throw at you. I want to tell you a little more about the Michael Bone slaying because a suspect was actually seen, and that is huge considering police think that these cases may be connected. There was also what I consider to be crucial evidence left behind at the scene. Michael was delivering bread to Natter's Market at 3065 South, 700 East on the afternoon of September 2nd, 1971, when an armed man came in and fired shots at both Michael and Carolyn. A bullet struck Michael in his left cheek and exited his right eye, and the bullet that hit Carolyn entered through her right temple and fragmented. The suspect took less than $100, and there was another delivery man present, and I've read conflicting statements, but either the suspect's gun jammed or he ran out of ammo. Either way, that delivery man was extremely lucky that day, and he got a look at the suspect. And he was described as being short with curly hair, well-groomed, and between 18 to 20 years old. A, quote, nice-looking boy. A watch was also found at the scene, believed to be the suspect's, which he lost during the struggle. And we actually have a picture, people. It's described as being a Timex watch with a dark blue face without numbers and Roman numerals on the gold case outside the watch. The watch band is nylon with blue and gray stripes. There was also a car at the scene with its engine running, which was described as being a 1959 black Chevrolet Impala 4-door sedan. Wow, it's almost hard to believe the person who did this has never been caught with all of that information. Okay, so I know that was a lot to take in, so let's talk about it. Police believe these cases are connected. Why? Because the same caliber of gun was used. They were also committed within a relatively short time frame of one another. Also, let's not forget about the cars. August 26th, days after Johanna's murder, police issued an all-points bulletin on 2 cars and their drivers believed to be involved in her assault and murder. Captain Haywood said that the cars were seen the night of August 20th near 2100 South and State Street, where Johanna was last seen. The cars were described as a 1970 to 1971 orange Dodge Charger with a white racing stripe on the sides and a black stripe on the rear, driven by a person being described only as young and blonde. Wait for it. The second car was described as being a black or dark green 1959 or 1960 Chevrolet. Sound familiar? Driven by a 25-year-old white male with hair down to his ears. Witnesses also described the Chevrolet as having an engine that sounded like a washing machine. And while you could definitely say the descriptions of the drivers were more than vague, the descriptions of the vehicles were not. And that's why I find it so hard to believe that they weren't able to track down the owners of those vehicles, especially the orange Charger with racing stripes. I feel like that's the kind of car that would not go unnoticed. And who knows, maybe they did locate the drivers and question them, but didn't have enough evidence to file charges against them. I just feel like investigators haven't really said much about the case, which again is necessary when protecting the integrity of the case, but really, nearly 53 years later, I don't see how keeping information close to the belt would be helpful in solving this case after so much time has gone by. Especially considering officials have said files on the case were damaged by flooding years ago. Officials also exhumed Johanna's body in 2017, but have yet to release the results, if any, to her family members. At this point, I think you'd have better luck reaching out to the public, but hey, that's just me. I will say that in an old article, Captain Haywood said, quote, "Our biggest handicap in this investigation is that no one involved with the victim or at the complex that night will come forward and offer information. We have to keep going back to find individuals to check out certain pieces of information, and this uses up a lot of time. No one wants to get involved, and this makes our job harder." I'm going to go ahead and assume that there were at least a dozen people at the complex that night, if not more, and nobody wanted to offer up any information. That just doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and it makes me think that maybe there was legal activity going on that night and nobody wanted to get in trouble. It also makes me think that more than one person was involved. I've always kind of felt that more than one person did this to Johanna. I don't know why. Maybe because she was last seen with multiple people, and the brutality of the attack makes me feel this way. But I always think of that saying, two can keep a secret if one of them is dead. If there were multiple people involved, you would think it would have come out by now, but that's not always the case. Now, I want to dive into theories on this case, or at least try to. It's kind of hard because the details surrounding this case could potentially support the idea that Johanna did not know her killer or killers. Nobody has come forward and said who she was last seen with, and we've never been able to identify the owners of the vehicles mentioned. This makes me think that they weren't necessarily from the area, or maybe they were just passing through. It's been stated multiple times that students from both Olympus and Skyline High frequently hung out there, and you're telling me that nobody, not one person, recognized who Johanna was talking to. I just don't know how I feel about that. If they weren't from the area, that could also explain why they were never able to track down the drivers of the dark Chevrolet and the orange Dodge. Maybe there were no records of those cars in the area. But then that leads to my biggest question. Why did this happen? I mean, there's never a good reason to sexually assault and brutally murder a young woman. But if police believe all these cases are connected, Johanna's definitely stands out due to the overall brutality. When thinking about the other murders, you could say the motive was money. But what was the motive with Johanna? It definitely seems like overkill and maybe a little personal. I don't know, but something's telling me that Johanna didn't know her killers. Maybe she met them that night and decided to leave with them, and at some point things took a very dark turn. Or maybe she did know her killers and someone had it out for her. But as I've stated in other videos, if that were the case, you would think someone would know if she had problems with anyone or if anyone was interested in her romantically. And if she did have problems with someone, I don't think she would leave in a car with them. I don't know. Those are just some of the thoughts I have. Let me know what you guys think. I can honestly say I have so much respect for Johanna's family. They have never given up on finding out who did this to Johanna and speak out on her murder often. They're frustrated, and rightfully so. This case is still considered active to the Unified Police Department, and because of that, the family hasn't really gotten any information on the case over the years. Unfortunately, Johanna's parents died before she saw justice. Her brother, Jack Leatherbury, said they went to their grave completely changed people. Her siblings and nieces haven't stopped looking for answers, and her sister Roxanne Bowe stated, quote, "She tried hard to please other people, help us all. I don't know. I miss her a lot," end quote. Even her cousin, Sandy Leatherbury, spoke out on the case saying, quote, "We weren't privy to hardly anything. We appealed for the file and we were denied. We just didn't have any follow through. There was no follow through. Nothing. Just put up on a shelf and left." Her family just doesn't believe that her murder is getting the investigation that it deserves, and law enforcement disagrees, saying that they have a cold case investigator actively working on Johanna's case. Johanna's family has since reached out to the Utah Cold Case Coalition and is working with them to hopefully finally get somewhere. Jason Jensen, a private investigator and the co-founder of the organization, believes that the killer was from the Salt Lake City area, so I mean, that's something. My heart just really hurts for Johanna's family, and after all these years, they deserve some sense of closure. There is a strong possibility that whoever did this is dead and never faced the consequences for their actions. But even if that is the case, Johanna's death needs answers. And like with all of these cases, there is somebody out there that knows something. If you have any information on Johanna's case, contact Detective Ben Pender at 385-468-9816 or the Utah Cold Case Coalition via their tip line at 385-258-3777. Thank you all for listening to Johanna's story. I really do appreciate it, and I will see you all next time, a lot sooner than last, with another case. Bye.